Our top focus on Beyond at this hour, NATO allies discussed options to support freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz, while emphasizing that the initiative was not a NATO mission. The discussions come as the United States maintains pressure on Iran, with President Donald Trump saying that the Strait of Hormuz is now an American territory. NATO's top commander, U.S. Air Force General Alexis Grinkevich, convened a video conference earlier this week, bringing together interested allies under the umbrella of Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe at the Chief of Defense level. Now, the discussions had centered on what individual countries could contribute to help secure freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. NATO has been careful to draw a line between facilitating coordination and taking military ownership of the mission. According to the spokesperson of the commander, NATO was only facilitating the discussions because of its ability to bring allies together and assess the capabilities that they could bring to the effort. That distinction had underlined the core dilemma facing the alliance. While NATO members wanted to support safe shipping and protect the critical global energy route, any direct NATO involvement could have drawn the alliance deeper into the conflict with Iran. Instead, allied countries had been looking at arrangements outside the alliance to help reopen the strait. Now, the Strait of Hormuz had carried about a fifth of all traded oil before the conflict began in February, making its security a major international concern. In fact, France and Britain have therefore led efforts to build a separate coalition of around a dozen countries to help guarantee safe passage. Adding to the predicament, U.S. President Donald Trump has taken a harder line on Iran, claiming that U.S. has total control over the Strait of Hormuz and the surrounding region. He said diplomacy had not yet produced what he considered the right deal in his view.
We have total control, as you know, of the border. We have total control. If you look at the blockade, we have total control of that entire region having to do with the Strait of Hormuz. And that means well into it, the land areas. So they would love to make a deal, but they're not ready to make the right deal, in my opinion.
While Trump had called for greater economic pressure against Iran as Washington sought to curb Tehran's ability to fund and project power through its proxies. When asked whether the focus on economic pressure meant military options were limited, Trump had rejected the idea, saying the United States was watching how the situation developed. Listen to this.
No, not at all. It just means that we're seeing what happens. They have no money. They have no Navy. They have no Air Force. They are not paying their soldiers. They're not paying their police. They have 350% inflation. So we're just going to sort of see what happens.
And for more on this, we're now being joined by Peter Curzon from London. He's a former UN World Bank official, economist, geopolitical and international policy professor. Thank you so much, Piotr, for joining us on the broadcast. Now, NATO is very carefully saying that this is not a NATO mission, even though its top military headquarters is now bringing interested allies together over Hormuz. Now, what does that deliberate distinction here tell us about the political sensitivity inside the alliance over getting directly involved in the Iran conflict, according to you?
Well, NATO has a legacy of problematic operations in the Middle East. Obviously, the only time Article 5 was activated, which is the infamous attack on one is attack on all, was after 9/11, when the United States activated and a coalition of countries came to fight on behalf of the United States in Afghanistan, which is why Trump's comments around Britain, France, other countries not having lent soldiers, the Danish, obviously Greenland, is such an insult to countries that have always been there for America. So this is a sensitive issue for NATO, but also I think it demonstrates that NATO has the capacity to operate, or it shows that it isn't just America and others. It is a coalition of 32 nations, and those other 31 nations other than America can say, we're not that interested, or we don't know if we want to get more involved in your war of choice. So NATO is balancing wanting to be seen as active or relevant, the political side of it versus the operational side, which is seemingly happening more sort of on the sidelines. The coalition of a willing is different to NATO. And so you've got groups of countries that are working sort of together, but not under the auspices of NATO. So it doesn't have that legal sort of accreditation, so to speak.
Right, but having said that, what do you think Washington ultimately wants from NATO allies here? Is this immediate objective simply to share the burden of securing global shipping, or perhaps is Trump trying here to make European countries materially invested in this broader strategy of pressuring Iran?
Well, I think that's only one side of the angle. The other side is obviously the Financial Times had an article early in the week stating that insiders are considering, that's insiders in Iran, are considering targeting European bases. So it's not just the push factors from Trump, it's the push factors from potentially threats from the IRGC, which obviously changes the calculus for a lot of European capitals a lot. And I mean, I have quite strong opinions about this. I don't really care what Trump wants European nations to do. European nations are sovereign states, and they should be able to, and rightfully so, determine whether or not to get involved with one of the most pointless wars in recent memory. So I think it's been a very wise decision of European nations to make it very clear that they will help with the post-conflict reconstruction, freedom of navigation, but not the conflict itself. And that's obviously been frustration for Trump. He wants an offensive involvement from Europe, and the Europeans are like, no, we're going to be defensive, which is a minor distinction, but important in international law and, of course, for Trump's strategic decision making and position.
Iran has consistently opposed foreign military forces in the Strait. So could a larger Western presence perhaps in the Strait of Hormuz risk becoming another trigger for escalation for Iran?
It could. This is the problem. I think with well, we did have a deal, but Trump seems to want another one now, and the MOU not being good enough. But essentially, this is the sensitivity, because if the United States and Iran do establish some kind of agreement, but then the NATO alliance or the coalition of the willing want to provide some kind of security assurances to freedom of navigation, that could deteriorate things again. However, the general sentiment, I think, for a lot of your viewers and the broader global South is obviously sympathy with the Iranian position versus the war by Trump. But I think even in that situation, if Iran were to start targeting any and all ships that were trying to shadow tankers that were providing, undertaking economic activity, trespassing the Strait of Hormuz, I think the sentiment would shift. Initially, like with the October 7th, a lot of countries understood Israel's position, but over time, people have shifted to thinking Israel's gone too far. So people's opinion could shift to being a bit more opposed to what Iran is doing if it impeded provision of energy. I mean, India is obviously hugely dependent on lots of energy that comes out of the Gulf. So I don't think it would be wise for the Iranians to do that, but you'd have to involve them as a stakeholder in any and all kind of a conversation about maritime security and so on. But I still think we're a long way off from that.
Right, and coming back to NATO saying that it wants to support the freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz without the NATO label. NATO's own military leadership has previously argued that Hormuz has consequences for European security because disruption to energy flows, it does affect European economies and ultimately the defense industrial capacity. So having said that, do you think the alliance is also gradually redefining what counts as a European security issue?
Oh, for sure. I mean, this is the complicated aspect. It's not just about NATO. It's the European Union. And of course, Europe as a continent, because certain countries aren't part of NATO. They're not part of the EU in the case of London or Britain, but they all have to work together. So NATO is the sort of figurehead, if you like, of the security architecture. But lots of countries do operate independently of it. There's even concerns, one report I read this morning, that people are worried about the French election next year. If Marine Le Pen and her party win, then they could possibly leave NATO. And so that's a huge blow to the alliance. So you've got a situation where the alliance is having to redefine not only its protocols, but its operations, but also its regional focus. You've got the High North with the Arctic, you've got the Russian Eastern Front, and of course, you've got the southern areas with immigration and the instabilities with the Middle East. So NATO has a balancing act of trying to navigate how it deals with something where America isn't as involved, potentially. It's known as NATO minus, but also not overextending itself that it can't do anything at all. So I think you're seeing a pragmatic but also cautious approach from the alliance, and it will be interesting to see how, as the war continues, what the NATO alliance tries to do, what European nations try to do. But certainly, and this will be my last point, Europe is undergoing a fundamental recalibration of its security and strategic autonomy.
Right, of course, we'll have to wait and see how NATO balances that. But thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast, Piotr, and thank you for sharing your valuable perspective with us and our viewers.
Thank you as always.